The late-day sun cast long shadows across the dust-covered pens at the Mitchell County auction yard. The air buzzed with the smell of hay, sweat, and dry wood. Inside a quiet corner pen lay a young chestnut colt with a splash of white running down his forehead. He was small, awkward, and thin, too thin. His legs shook every time he tried to shift. Alone, nameless, and unclaimed, he sat curled into the fence like he was trying to disappear into it. Around him, the murmurs of disinterest grew louder with each minute. Clayton Burke, the auctioneer, stood at the podium tapping the gavel in rhythm. "Young colt here. Strong spirit, just needs raisin'. Startin' at 50. Who'll take him?" Silence. A few heads turned, but no hands rose. 40. Clayton tried. Still nothing. A gruff voice cut through the crowd. Gus Darnell, leaning against the rails with his arms crossed. "Ain't no use payin' for bones that won't run," he muttered. Some laughed. The colt blinked slowly, but didn't react. He just watched, as if waiting for someone to see him. The crowd shifted when boots crunched across the dirt. Elwood Raines stepped forward. His presence carried weight, not just from age, but from a lifetime of keeping quiet and doing what needed to be done. Dressed in a worn suede vest and faded denim, he looked more like a man paying respects than placing a bid. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out $60 in weathered bills. "I'll take him," he said. "Sold," Clayton shouted, more surprised than anyone else. The gavel struck wood. Some stared. Royce Teller leaned toward his fellow ranch hand, Bo Hensley. "Has he finally cracked?" Royce whispered. Elwood didn't respond to the looks or the whispers. He walked slowly to the pen, then dropped to one knee before the colt. The young horse lifted his head. His eyes, wide and unsure, met Elwood's steady gaze. Then, hesitant, almost fragile, he reached out and pressed his forehead softly into the rancher's hand. "You're Bramble now," Elwood whispered. The name felt right. Small, tough, and wild, just like the little thing in front of him. The colt closed his eyes for a moment and leaned in deeper, like he finally understood he wasn't alone anymore. As they led Bramble into the trailer, Royce called out again. "What do you see in that one?" Elwood looked over his shoulder. "I see something y'all missed." And as the truck pulled away, dust curling behind the tires, no one imagined that the life Elwood thought was behind him was about to begin again, with a colt no one else wanted. The drive back to the Raines ranch was quiet, except for the occasional rattle of the trailer hitch and the soft shuffle of hooves behind Elwood's truck. The old Ford rolled down dusty roads lined with fading fence posts and swaying fields of golden grass. Inside the trailer, Bramble lay curled in the straw, his eyes flicking open with every bump. He didn't cry or panic. He just lay still, as if unsure whether this new silence was safety or another kind of waiting. Elwood glanced in the rearview mirror more times than he'd admit, checking on the colt like he was carrying something fragile, something he couldn't afford to lose. Back at the ranch, the sun had dipped behind the cottonwoods, casting long shadows across the weathered barn and rusted gates. Royce, Bo, and the others were already waiting, leaning against the fence, their expressions a mix of curiosity and doubt. As Elwood lowered the ramp, Bramble didn't move at first. His legs trembled when he tried to stand, his front right leg buckling slightly. "Easy, boy," Elwood muttered, stepping up to guide him. Bramble looked at him, ears twitching, and took one cautious step forward, then another. "He ain't gonna last a week," Royce muttered to no one in particular. Elwood ignored it. He led Bramble slowly across the yard toward an empty stall beside the main barn. The colt's hooves dragged through the dirt like he'd never walked this far before. But he followed. Willingly. Every step was a choice, and that mattered. Inside the stall, Elwood spread fresh straw and filled a bucket with water. Bramble dipped his nose in cautiously, sniffed, then drank deeply. It was the first Rayol drink he'd had since the auction. Later that night, Long after the other hands had gone, Elwood returned to the stall with a lantern in hand. Bramble was lying down, legs tucked awkwardly beneath him, his head resting on the straw. Elwood leaned against the door, arms crossed, eyes heavy. Something in the way Bramble breathed, uneven, unsure, reminded him of another time, another creature he'd once tried to save. A flash of memory flickered in his mind, a younger horse, a storm, a scream he hadn't forgotten. Elwood shook the thought off and whispered, "You made it this far. That's gotta mean something." Bramble twitched his ears but didn't move. The lantern light flickered softly across the colt's chestnut coat, casting shadows that danced like ghosts on the stall walls. Elwood stayed there a while, not speaking, just watching. And then, just as he turned to leave, Bramble let out the faintest sound, low, broken, almost like a whimper. Elwood froze. Something was wrong. And deep down, he knew this wasn't going to be as simple as giving the colt a home. The next morning broke cold and gray. A layer of mist hugged the low hills around the Raines ranch, and the barn stood quiet under a sky that hadn't made up its mind between rain or silence. Elwood stepped into the stall before sunrise, lantern in hand. Bramble was still lying down, his breathing shallow, his ears flicking weakly at the sound of footsteps. Elwood crouched beside him, resting a hand lightly against the colt's flank. It was warm, too warm. A fever. He didn't need a vet to tell him that. Outside, Royce was loading feed bags onto the back of the flatbed truck when he spotted Elwood emerging from the barn. "That colt ain't getting up, is he?" he called out. Elwood didn't answer right away. "He's fightin' it," he finally said. "I've seen worse come back." Royce shook his head and muttered something under his breath about stubborn old men and lost causes. But Elwood had heard that kind of talk before. Years ago. Different colt. Different time. Same feeling in his gut, that maybe this was more than just bad luck. He made the call to a local vet, Dr. Maeve Collier, someone he hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. Her voice on the phone was crisp but kind. "You said the colt's been down since yesterday?" she asked. "Not eating, running hot?" Elwood nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Bringin' my kit," she said. "Be there by noon." Elwood didn't mention Bramble's leg, or the way the colt had cried out in the night like something deeper than illness was tearing through him. He wasn't ready to say that out loud. By mid-morning, Elwood was kneeling beside Bramble again, trying to coax him to stand. "Come on now," he whispered, brushing straw from the colt's shoulder. "You made it out of that place. Don't stop here." Bramble blinked slowly, nostrils flaring with effort, and shifted. He managed to push himself up, legs wobbling underneath him like saplings in a storm. But he stood. Barely. Elwood steadied him with both arms. That's when he noticed something. A raised patch under Bramble's neck, just beneath the fur. Subtle, but firm to the touch. He pressed gently. Bramble flinched hard, almost collapsing again. Elwood pulled back, frowning. That wasn't normal. It felt like scar tissue. Old, healed over, but deep. Too deep for a colt this young to have on its own. Before he could inspect further, he heard tires crunching across gravel. The vet had arrived. But Elwood's heart was already racing. Something wasn't adding up. And whatever had happened to Bramble before that auction, he was starting to think it wasn't just neglect. Dr. Maeve Collier stepped out of her silver pickup with the same quiet confidence she'd always carried. Tall, sharp-eyed, with gray-streaked hair pulled into a low ponytail and a stethoscope hanging from her coat pocket, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Where is he?" she asked, walking straight toward the barn. Elwood nodded toward the stall and held the door open for her. They hadn't spoken face-to-face in years, not since a bad winter and an even worse goodbye, but now wasn't the time for old wounds. Inside, Bramble stood barely upright, his legs trembling, his head drooping low. Maeve knelt beside him, her fingers moving with the practiced touch of someone who'd seen too many animals break, and some come back. "He's running hot," she muttered, checking his gums. "Dehydrated, but not critical. Whatever he's fighting, it started before you brought him home." Elwood nodded, silently watching. His jaw was tight. His eyes never left the colt. Then Maeve found it. Her hand brushed along Bramble's neck and paused. "What's this?" she said, brow furrowing. She pressed gently against the raised patch Elwood had felt earlier. Bramble jerked in pain. "That's not from a fall," she murmured. "It's healed over. Deep." She looked up at Elwood. "This colt's been through something. And I don't mean neglect. Someone did this." Elwood felt something cold settle in his chest. "You think it's a brand?" he asked. Maeve shook her head. "Not a brand. No pattern. And it's not on the usual spot." She reached into her bag and pulled out a portable scanner. "But there's one thing it could be," she added. "And if I'm right, we're gonna have a problem." She ran the scanner over the area, and a beep echoed softly in the stall. Both of them froze. "It's a microchip," she confirmed, eyes narrowing. "This horse is registered." Elwood stepped back. "Registered?" "But the auction paperwork said." "They either didn't check," she cut in, "or someone didn't want them to." She pulled out her tablet, tapping into the National Registry database. A few seconds passed. Then her face changed. Not shock, something heavier. She turned the screen toward Elwood. The image was blurry but unmistakable. Bramble, younger, cleaner, and under a different name. Elwood stared at the name on the screen. Then at the owner listed below it. His stomach twisted. He recognized the last name. It wasn't just a stranger's colt he'd brought home. Bramble belonged to someone from Elwood's past, someone he never thought he'd hear from again. The name on the registry hit Elwood like a kick to the chest: Jonas Raines. The last time he'd heard that name was 15 years ago, when the two of them had stood on opposite sides of a courtroom, and the judge's gavel had come down hard. Jonas was his younger brother, born of the same blood but raised with a fire Elwood could never tame. They hadn't spoken since the fight, an ugly one that ended with bitter words and broken ties. And now, somehow, Jonas's name was tied to this horse. Elwood stepped outside the barn, needing air. The weight in his chest was thick and familiar. Maeve followed, wiping her hands on a rag, careful with her words. "You know him," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Elwood gave a short nod, his eyes on the hills beyond the pasture. "He's my brother," he finally said. "Or was." The wind stirred the grass. In the silence, Maeve said nothing. She knew the pain of family better than most. "He always was reckless," Elwood muttered, almost to himself. "Had this way of runnin' through things, animals, people, everything. Said he wanted to breed racehorses. Start his own line. I told him he didn't have the sense for it. We fought over the ranch, over how Dad left things. He walked out and never came back." Elwood's voice cracked just slightly. "And now this colt shows up at an auction, half dead, chipped to his name." Maeve folded her arms. "It doesn't make sense. A registered colt like Bramble doesn't just end up at a backwoods auction unless someone wanted him lost." She looked up at him. "You think Jonas is in trouble?" Elwood didn't answer. He didn't want to care, but part of him already did. And that part burned like an old scar touched by rain. Back inside the barn, Bramble had managed to stand again. He nickered weakly when Elwood returned, his ears turning toward him like he was listening for something unspoken. Elwood stepped into the stall, ran his hand gently down the colt's neck. "What did he do to you, boy?" he whispered. "And why'd he let you go?" There was no answer, only the sound of Bramble's breathing and the creak of the old wooden boards beneath them. Elwood turned to Maeve. "Run that registry again," he said. "See if Jonas listed a farm. An address. Anything." Maeve nodded, but her face said she already knew this was more than a favor. This was unfinished business. And Bramble, quiet and broken as he was, had just reopened a door Elwood thought was closed forever. Maeve sat at the small desk near the barn office, her fingers tapping against the tablet screen. The registry system was slow, but reliable. After a few moments, an address popped up under Jonas Raines's name. Pine Hollow Acres, a small property 3 counties over. No phone number. No active vet records. Just a location and a signature dated almost 2 years ago. She glanced at Elwood, who hadn't said much since reading the name. He just stood there, hands on his hips, staring out toward the pasture like the land could give him answers. Elwood finally spoke, voice low. "I thought he was out west. Heard he went to Oklahoma after Dad passed. Figured he'd burned through whatever money he got and disappeared." Maeve looked up. Maybe he did. Maybe he came back. She hesitated. "You gonna go see him?" Elwood didn't answer at first. He turned toward Bramble's stall, where the colt was now standing more firmly, nibbling weakly at a flake of hay. "If Jonas had a hand in what happened to that colt," he said slowly, "I need to know why." That night, Elwood couldn't sleep. He lay in bed with the window open, the breeze carrying the sound of night insects and distant coyotes. But it wasn't the ranch that kept him awake. It was the memory of Jonas's voice, shouting across a field long ago. The words weren't clear anymore, but the anger was. And the hurt. They had grown up in the same house but lived 2 different lives. Elwood had chosen duty. Jonas had chosen fire. And now, somehow, their choices had led back to this fragile animal lying in his barn. At dawn, Elwood saddled his truck with water, a few tools, and a rifle, just in case. Maeve was already there, packing a first aid kit. "Thought you might need someone who can speak in full sentences," she said, offering a dry smile. Elwood almost cracked a grin. "Almost. You don't have to come." Maeve shrugged. "I've got a quiet morning. Besides, I want to see what kind of man lets a colt like that get tossed aside." Before they left, Elwood stopped by Bramble's stall one more time. The colt lifted his head slowly. He looked better, stronger, but there was still something in his eyes. Not just pain. Something older. Worn. Elwood reached in and ran his hand down Bramble's face. "We'll be back soon," he said. "With answers." As the truck pulled out of the driveway and onto the long road toward Pine Hollow, Elwood felt the weight settle again in his chest. He didn't know what he'd find at that farm, or if Jonas was even there. But one thing was certain. This wasn't just about a horse anymore. This was about family. About betrayal. And about a past that refused to stay buried. The gravel crackled beneath Elwood's tires as the truck rolled to a stop in front of the faded wooden sign that read Pine Hollow Acres. Weeds had overrun the driveway, curling up between the boards of the porch and overtaking the rusted fencing. The house itself leaned slightly to the left, like time had pushed it harder than the wind ever could. Elwood stepped out, boots crunching in the silence. No birds. No movement. Just the creak of a nearby windmill turning lazily in the breeze. Maeve climbed out behind him, eyes scanning the area. "Doesn't look like anyone's lived here in a while," she said. "Not properly, anyway." Elwood didn't reply. He walked slowly toward the porch, every step stirring old memories of nights spent arguing with Jonas about land, legacy, and everything their father left behind. The door was unlocked. No surprise there. It opened with a dry groan, revealing a dim, stale interior. Inside, dust coated everything like a second skin. A few broken chairs, yellowed papers scattered across a table, and a single framed photo on the mantel. Elwood and Jonas as boys, standing beside their father and a tall black mare. Elwood stared at it a long time. He didn't pick it up. Didn't need to. The ache in his chest had already arrived. "He was here," he muttered. Maeve moved past him into what looked like a small office. "Take a look at this," she called. Elwood stepped in. On the desk were veterinary receipts, feed invoices, and a ledger. Many pages were torn out, but one remained, dated 6 months ago. It listed the sale of a colt named Red Sky Blaze, which matched the registry name Bramble had been chipped under. Buyer name, private. No contact. No address. Just a dollar amount circled in red, $400. Elwood's jaw tightened. He sold him. Maeve frowned. To someone who didn't want to be found. Elwood stepped back, hands on his hips. That colt was never meant to be raised. He was discarded. Like trash. A moment of silence stretched between them. Then Maeve said what neither wanted to consider, or maybe Jonas didn't sell him at all. They searched the barn next. It was half collapsed, the roof sagging under years of neglect. But in the corner, under a pile of old tarps and broken tack, Elwood found something that stopped him cold. A blood-stained halter with the initials JR burned into the leather. Maeve looked at him, concern darkening her features. "Elwood, I think something happened here." Elwood didn't answer. But deep down, he already knew. Jonas hadn't just abandoned the colt. He might have vanished for good. Elwood stared at the blood-stained halter in his hands. The leather was stiff and cracked, but the initials JR were unmistakable. He hadn't spoken Jonas's name aloud in years, and now it sat heavy on his tongue like a curse. Maeve stood a few steps back, her hand hovering near her phone. She wasn't the kind to panic easily, but this wasn't normal. Not for a man to vanish without a trace, and not for a horse like Bramble to show up half dead at an auction with no explanation. They combed the barn inch by inch. In one of the back stalls, Elwood found drag marks in the dirt, long, uneven, as if something heavy had been pulled across the ground. Nearby, the old feed bin was half open. Inside, beneath a layer of cracked corn, lay a pile of shredded papers, some charred at the edges. Elwood fished one out carefully. A letter. Water-damaged, but parts still readable. "He's not safe here. They know about the chip." That was all he could make out. Maeve looked over his shoulder. "You think Jonas was hiding the colt?" Elwood nodded slowly. "Or trying to protect him." His voice was tight. That scar on Bramble. It wasn't just a wound. It was a cover-up. Someone didn't want him traced. Maeve's eyes narrowed. But why? Elwood didn't answer. His mind was already racing. Something darker was buried here, not just under the dust and straw, but in whatever Jonas had gotten himself tangled in. Back at the truck, Elwood reached for the photo they'd taken from the mantel. He hadn't wanted it, but now it felt necessary. In the picture, Jonas held the reins of that tall black mare, their father's prize horse. But in the corner of the image, half-shadowed, stood a younger colt. Chestnut coat. White blaze. Bramble. He'd been in their family longer than Elwood realized. Which meant this wasn't just any horse. This was legacy. And someone had tried to erase it. They drove back in silence. The air between them was heavy with questions they couldn't yet ask. When they arrived at the ranch, the sun was already dipping below the hills, painting the sky in orange and ash. Bramble stood at the fence, watching them like he'd been waiting the whole time. Elwood walked up slowly, resting a hand on the colt's forehead. "You remember him, don't you?" he whispered. Bramble didn't move. But his eyes held something Elwood couldn't explain, something that looked a lot like grief. And far off in the distance, a truck engine roared across the highway, heading straight for Coldwater Road. The rumble of the engine grew louder as it neared the Raines ranch. Elwood stood still beside Bramble, eyes narrowed toward the driveway. Maeve emerged from the barn, wiping her hands with a rag, her expression shifting from calm to alert. The old blue truck slowed, then stopped at the gate. Dust swirled around the tires as the engine cut off. For a long moment, no one stepped out. Then the driver's side door opened. Jonas Raines looked older. His hair, once black and wild, was streaked with gray. His eyes were sunken, skin thinner, like he'd spent more nights running than sleeping. But there was no mistaking him. Same frame, same walk. And when his eyes met Elwood's, time fell away like brittle bark. Neither man spoke. Not at first. Jonas glanced at the colt, and his shoulders dropped. "You found him," he said quietly. Elwood's voice was like gravel. "He found me." The words cut more than he intended, but he didn't take them back. Maeve stayed silent, standing between them but watching everything. Jonas stepped closer, slow and cautious. "They were going to put him down," he said. "Said he was born wrong. Said he wouldn't run, wouldn't breed. I chipped him myself. Tried to hide him until I could get him somewhere safe." His voice trembled. "Then I got in over my head." Elwood's jaw clenched. "You left him to die in a livestock auction, Jonas." Jonas looked away, shame rippling through his features. "I didn't have a choice. People were watching. I figured, better a chance at being bought than a bullet." Bramble, standing between them, gave a soft whinny and stepped forward, first toward Jonas, then paused, as if unsure who he belonged to anymore. "I wanted to come back," Jonas said, voice raw now. "But I didn't know how. Everything I touched turned to fire. And you?" He looked at Elwood with something close to apology. "You were always the one who stayed. I wasn't." Elwood stepped forward slowly, stopping just a few feet away. For a long second, the two brothers stared at each other. Not as enemies. Not even as family. Just two men, each carrying too much silence. Elwood finally asked, "What exactly did you get involved in, Jonas?" Jonas hesitated. "There's a man. A breeder from out west. Big money. Illegal stuff. He wanted Bramble gone because of bloodlines tied to our mare. He thought Bramble would expose everything. The weight of the truth hung between them." And then, from the end of the road, another engine approached, fast. Maeve's hand moved instinctively to her phone. They weren't alone anymore. The second truck came fast, its headlights cutting through the early dusk like searchlights. Elwood stepped in front of Bramble on instinct, his hand brushing the colt's neck. Jonas stiffened beside him, eyes narrowing. Maeve dialed her phone but didn't hit call, yet. The truck skidded slightly as it stopped just outside the gate. A tall man in a black windbreaker stepped out, clipboard in hand, posture too stiff to be a local. "Evenin'," he said smoothly. "I'm looking for Jonas Raines." Jonas didn't answer. Elwood did. "What for?" The man didn't flinch. "Federal investigation. Suspicion of fraud, illegal animal trafficking. One of the horses, Red Sky Blaze, was listed as destroyed, yet here he is." He gestured toward Bramble. The colt stood still, silent, but his eyes darted between the men. Jonas exhaled shakily. "I didn't sell bloodstock. I tried to protect it. That colt is part of our family's line. They were going to erase him." The agent nodded, as if he already knew. "You'll need to come with me, Mr. Raines. There's an open file, but your cooperation could change a lot." Elwood looked at his brother, jaw tight. For the first time in decades, Jonas didn't argue. He just gave a faint nod. "You take care of him," he said to Elwood, glancing at Bramble. "I never could." As the agent led Jonas to the truck, Elwood stood rooted in place. The sun dipped below the hills, casting the ranch in a long shadow. Maeve stepped beside him. "He did the wrong thing," she said gently. "But maybe for the right reasons." Elwood nodded. "Doesn't make it hurt less." Behind them, Bramble nudged his shoulder, gentle like a breath of wind. Elwood turned, placing a steady hand on the colt's neck. "You're home now," he whispered. Weeks passed. The papers were cleared, the chip officially registered under Elwood's name. Bramble's strength returned. His coat thickened. The limp never fully left, but neither did his spirit. Maeve came by more often, bringing medicine, advice, and eventually, dinners. The ranch grew quieter, slower, but not emptier. One morning, Elwood opened the barn doors to find Bramble standing tall, ears perked, watching the sunrise. For the first time, the colt didn't look fragile. He looked proud, whole, like he understood that he had survived something no one else could name. Elwood leaned on the gate, a coffee mug in hand, and whispered to no one in particular, "Funny thing, what you end up keepin'. Sometimes it ain't land or blood. Sometimes it's the broken things that stay and mend you right back." And Bramble, once discarded, once forgotten, became not just a reminder of the past, but the start of everything that came after.